So it's just wishful thinking if we think that someday some sort of magic is going to happen, and China. One needs to understand how Chinese foreign, because foreign policy is not made in some sort of a silo.
Yeah.
That country's culture, mindset, thinking, philosophy all gets into it. There is a very clear-cut saying in phrase in Chinese that there can be only one tiger in one mountain. That mountain being Asia. There cannot be two tigers.
Yeah.
So why would China allow another tiger to even emerge within Asia? If it has to be India, why would it allow it?
Welcome to Stratnewsglobal. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Welcome to another edition of The Gist. And today we are focusing on the BRICS Summit in Kazan, which is only days away. Every day we are drawing closer to it. The Prime Minister is heading there, and a lot of the focus will be on speculation about his bilateral with China's President Xi Jinping. It will take place at a time when the India-China relationship is pretty fraught. There is a lot to be done on the border dispute. Things remain in limbo. And to discuss some of these issues, I have with me Sriparna Pathak of Jindal Global University. She's been on our shows before. She is a specialist on China, tracks the economy closely. And we have Saheb Singh Chadha. He's a research analyst with Carnegie India, a think tank. And he follows China, especially the India-China relationship and the military modernization programs that they are on. Welcome both. Glad to have you. Sriparna, I'll begin with you. Since you know Chinese, you know Mandarin, we had Xi Jinping's 75th anniversary address on Monday. What did he say? He spoke in Chinese and you listened in.
Well, he spoke about a lot of things. He talked about, the glory of the nation and trying to invoke a lot of nationalism and a nationalist spirit. The same sort of fervor which you would expect in a country which is trying to engage in some revolutionary fight or is seeking some sort of a glory. He very smartly and tacitly also talked about economic problems while covering them up. That's the typical Chinese style, of course. So he said a lot of things which basically, if you read deeply into it, basically mean that the economy is not doing very well. So they want to cover it up by pushing in a lot of nationalism because, well, nationalism is the last bastion of, of certain people, certain sorts of people or certain sorts of countries. So he did all of that. And of course, he does not want his people to lose faith in him or the CCP, which is why he has to speak in using a lot of nationalist and revolutionary tones.
And any assurances held out?
Assurances that, basically assurances in the terms like your lives are and your future is safe in the hands of the CCP is the guiding light and so on. Those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. So tell me, how bad is the economy?
Well, the economy is not doing well at all because, even if you just look at the banking sector, 40 banks were hit by debt in 2024. The slowdown has been the greatest. Even their own news agency, their economic news agency, ETSI, they themselves have said that this trend is going to accelerate in the next few years. So banks are hit, of course. Consumption is really, really low. Domestic consumption is really low. And for any developed economy, China shows all the signs of being a developed economy. But in a lot of things, it has a lot of peculiarities. Consumption is one of them. So their consumption hovers around 35 to 40%, which is not normal at all. It's been very difficult to push up the consumption. Now, if the people are not consuming, what do you do with the goods, right? So you'll have to look abroad. Well, abroad is also not willing to take in the goods. I think Biden only a few days ago slapped 100% duties on Chinese EVs, 25% on steel products, and so on. They've got their CHIP Act, etc., all protecting that biggest coveted market which China wants. Similarly for the EU. So the economy is not doing well at all. Their growth rates have also come crashing down. Even though the numbers that they've been giving out, they say, okay, roughly it's between 4 to 4.5. But looking at all the other indices, looking at independent researchers' statements, the economy is not growing beyond 1.5 or at best 2%.
Chadha, why don't you update us first on the border situation? There's been a stream of reports claiming that there is some movement forward, things are getting better, but nothing seems to actually move.
So I want to make 4 points basically. The first is that you have definitely since June, July, had doubling of efforts by both sides to, find some meeting ground and, create a positive atmosphere such that, you can have a bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping at either the BRICS Summit or the G20 Summit or, the East Asia Summit.
Yeah.
So there has been definitely redoubling of effort. This is the first high-level contact you've had in about 9 months since the push you had last year in August 2023 during, the BRICS Summit and the G20 Summit in Delhi, when hopes were pretty high that, you might arrive at some sort of...
Is this us pushing, or they are also ready to meet halfway?
So the Chinese, since September 2022, when the last disengagement happened, they have been pushing India to sort of move on from the standoff and, move past it and, unfreeze bilateral ties, move them forward. What's happened, I feel, on the Indian side, in June you had a new government come in, and I think there was a review of national security priorities, policy, including towards the standoff. And I at least feel that there's this realization that this policy of holding the broader relationship, sort of freezing it and using that to put pressure on the border to disengage, I feel that, that policy has run its course. So now we are trying something different. For the first time in 4 years, the Indian side's talking about stabilizing and rebuilding bilateral ties. Okay. We haven't used these words in the past 4 years. And you see that in the economic survey, it talks about investments from China. Slowly, some approvals are happening, which speaks to the needs of Indian economic industry as well, definitely. So I feel that now we're trying something different. It's a more dual track policy, because at the same time, we are still calling for complete disengagement. We're standing by that. Yeah. So I think that's the sort of slight policy shift on the Indian side. And speaking to your point about reports, I think a lot of it is, very prima facie reportage. Yeah. And so it tends to lose the nuance. So what's actually happened is you haven't had any watering down of position from either side. Yeah. Whether it was Prime Minister Modi in April or the Chinese president, the Chinese ambassador in May, or Minister Jaishankar saying it's an issue of patrolling rights. Yeah. That's simply a restatement of the facts. Yeah. What's happened is that since July, you have had both sides restating facts, but also trying to portray things more positively. So when Dr. Jaishankar says disengagement is 75% complete, that's a fact. 5 of 7 friction points have had disengagement. Yeah. But at the same time, it is framing things more positively. And to what end? Again, to have a meeting at one of these bilateral summits.
So it's a gamble for both sides.
It is definitely a gamble for both sides, and it could end like it did last year, where not much movement happened, and both India and China sort of had separate takeaways from that Modi-Xi conversation at BRICS. So it's definitely a gamble.
Sriparna, what would be, since the economic crisis you say in China is growing, and that is a major preoccupation for Xi Jinping, does that influence his policy towards India in any way?
Well, it influences his policy, or China's policy, towards the whole world, which is why you will see not so many hawkish statements coming out even with regards to the US. Since, largely March, April this year, you'll see a whole range of charm offensives aimed at India. Yeah. The new ambassador here, Xu Feihong, talking about how there should be Chinese EVs in India, etc. The fact is that, their consumption, as I said, is really low. So even their own vehicles, who's going to consume it? US has slapped tariffs on them, 100%. Yeah. A lot of European countries are also doing it. So look towards whom? Well, the country which has amongst or the best growth rates in the world and has the highest population and the appetite for a whole lot of goods which China does manufacture. So there is that sort of charm offensive. Because China needs markets to grow. Its industrial policy since the reforms and opening up of late 1970s has focused always on external markets, which is why domestic consumption is so low. Yeah. They've been driven by exports and by investment. So which is why China is constantly on the lookout. But does that really mean that there's going to be any sort of softening on the border issue? I really don't think so, because even a few days ago, China tried sending some sort of a deterrent message with a missile intercept test near the Indian borders. The Chinese interlocutors have asked for very unreasonable patrolling rights at two very sensitive spots along the LSE and so on. So now the sovereignty would also be wanted and the market would also be wanted. So it's a more disastrous situation.
So would you say they are kind of upping the game with this kind of report coming out now?
They're definitely upping the game because historically, as it has happened in the past, China often says that India should not, even after Galwan Valley crisis, they said that we should not tie down our political or military problems with economic issues. And they've been constantly saying that, but in a very morally hectoring tone. But now the tone is changing because they also need the market. So the tone is changing, but the posture is still the same. So it's just that. Now, if we fall prey to it, too bad for us.
I just want to make one point, building on what Sriparna said and, expectations from the summit and what it means for the broader relationship and the border relationship. The best case outcome from the BRICS Summit or any of the upcoming summit would be that you have a Prime Minister Modi, President Xi Jinping bilateral meeting and they reach some consensus on disengagement, direct their officials to work towards the same. But this would still be one step in a series of steps that, we need both sides to take, and they haven't taken over the past 2 years. It would need to be disengagement followed by de-escalation because, as Dr. Jaishankar said, the broader issue is of the militarization of the border. So disengagement, de-escalation, de-induction, and at the same time, you'll need to have a very hard conversation on rebuilding the trust that has been lost in bilateral ties. Because the fact is both sides talk about the need to rebuild trust. On the Indian side, at least, we maintain that, China's actions in 2020, be it the massive build-up of forces, the unilateral attempt to change the status quo in 7 different points, or, the violent conduct of forces, be it in Galwan, Yangtze, other areas, or the Pangong Tso, you need to have a broader conversation on the trust that has been damaged and how to rebuild trust. And that needs to proceed alongside. So keeping this bigger picture in mind, I think, we should temper our expectations from the summit and look at what really needs to be done.
We talked of de-escalation and disengagement and all that. The way forward, this is a question for both of you. There was a number of agreements that we had signed with the Chinese in 1990s, early 2000. It seems those agreements are no longer valid. They've been torn up in a sense. Do we have to renegotiate? Do we upgrade those? And does it make any sense at all?
China has a practice. It does not really adhere to any of the agreements.
That's also the
Shimla agreement it signed, but it did not really ratify. So this won't be the first time. Now, if we keep expecting that China, if we renegotiate, spend in that much money, effort, time, and then China is going to somehow magically adhere to agreement signed, that's just wishful thinking. It's not done it with any country in the world. Why would it do it with us? With us especially, it's violated a lot of agreements in the past. So it's just wishful thinking if we think that, someday some sort of magic is going to happen and China. One needs to understand how Chinese foreign, because, foreign policy is not made in some sort of a silo. That country's culture, mindset, thinking, philosophy, all gets into it. There is a very clear-cut phrase in Chinese that, there can be only one tiger in one mountain. That mountain being Asia. There cannot be 2 tigers. So why would China allow another tiger to even emerge within Asia? If it has to be India, why would it allow it? So these are just wishful thinkings. There's a theory of internal balancing. Very often we talk about it in international relations theory, wherein a country just strengthens itself and is prepared for the worst. There are no permanent friends or foes in international politics, and there is no morality in international politics. One just has to fend for itself. So unless India can be economically strong, China is a country which is not going to respect or give any sort of respect. For China, the most important countries which it sees in its radar of being most important in its foreign policy calculations are US and Japan. That too primarily because of the economic and political power and the history also. Whereas us, we are seen as a potential threat which might emerge in the next few years. So unless we can generate that sort of respect, I don't think we should be even thinking of wasting time thinking let's renegotiate and hoping that China is going to magically adhere to agreements. It's not done that with others. It's wishful thinking, it'll do it with us.
Chadha, you have a take on this?
I have a slightly different point, actually. So these agreements now, the Indian sides maintain that China has violated these agreements through its conduct, but the fact that we keep referring back to them, even recently Dr. Jaishankar said, that China reneged on the border agreements. The fact that we keep referring back to them means that, they still, at least for India, they do hold some importance. And the fact is that, since the 1990s, these agreements served as the basic building blocks on the basis of which you developed a border management regime, you kept the peace at the border for 20 years or so, and on the basis of those agreements, you developed your broader relationship. And so they mattered then for that purpose, and they matter now for the same purpose as well. Because these agreements sort of take away from the anarchy that surrounds the fog of escalation. If you do have a crash, if you do have a clash, you have standard operating procedures, you have rules of engagement, if both sides choose to follow them, of course. So they reduce some of that ambiguity. The broader point I want to make is that these agreements in the 1990s were forged on the basis of a modus vivendi and a political understanding between the two sides that came about at that time. And at that time, India and China's internal and external conditions were very different. In India, we had just launched liberalization, privatization, globalization. We wanted to grow. We had insurgency in Kashmir, which we wanted to sort of, we were tackling. And so we needed a stable frontier. Externally as well, it was the end of the Cold War, and we had just lost our closest partner, the Soviet Union. America was cooperating with Pakistan because of Afghanistan. So we needed a stable periphery. For China also, you had similar imperatives. You had internal political stability questioned because of Tiananmen. You still had unrest in Xinjiang. And the collapse of the Soviet Union raised questions about the viability of communism as a political, social, economic model. Externally, China frankly thought it was next after the USSR in terms of regime change, and US-China relations particularly deteriorated following Tiananmen. So that was the situation 30 years ago, under which you had a modus vivendi and agreement signed. Today the situation is very different. Today India's continues to develop, has developed. We're a regional power. We've broken out of the South Asia box. We desire to and increasingly play a role in the Indo-Pacific. We have broader partnerships. China also obviously similarly has developed manifold. It's extended its writ over its territory, and it has relationships in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So I think we need a new political understanding that is in concert with these geopolitical realities, that recognizes these realities, and China recognizes India's realities and India's role as a regional power and India's status. So I think you need a sort of new political understanding, which again will reinforce these border agreements and broader agreements.
So there may be no need to negotiate a new set of, rather than just focusing on the current ones, maybe safeguards with some way, guardrails and all that?
See, I think even if you do have new agreements, they shouldn't come at the cost of the old ones. They certainly serve a purpose. You may need to update the old ones given new technologies, drones, over the horizon capabilities which weren't there in the 1990s, 2000s. So to keep in mind new technologies, but you need to keep in mind the broader political, circumstances.
Sriparna, you've studied China closely, you lived there, you've studied there. How does the average Chinese see India?
First, the average Chinese doesn't even know much about India, because the number of Indians in China is very low. If you see an average South Asian person over there, the average Chinese would assume it's a Pakistani, because even education and visas are weaponized. So since it's an all-weather friend, despite the fact that India is the most populous country in the world, so logically there should be the maximum number of students from India. But yes, there's a weaponization of education and visas and opportunities. So which is why the maximum number of students from South Asia would be Pakistanis. Second would be from Bangladesh. So which is why very often I would be mistaken either for a Pakistani or for a Bangladeshi. Yes, the older generation thinks very fondly of India. And this would be people, say, around 80 years of age. And they would sing, they can't say Awara Hoon, they would say Awala Hoon. They would sing that song. They would say all the nice things that existed before 1962. The younger generation, they watched a couple of films like 3 Idiots and so on. But yeah, that's about it. India is not very important enough. Secondly, even as soft power, our films do not really make it to Chinese, because there are blocks, etc. So there are multiple blocks on a multiple sort of a whole range of products from India, and these would also include soft power products, especially because China would want to lead the game even in as far as soft power is concerned, especially now that we are talking about the global south and so on. So the average awareness of the Chinese people, Chinese person about India or Indians is very, very low. Yes, there would be some sorts of racism from time to time on the social media space, etc. There is a racist term specifically for Indians in the Chinese language as well, which sometimes is there's an attempt to gloss over it, saying that it's historical and it goes down to soldiers from the British Indian Army and so on. But well, yes, the fact is that there's also a racist term against Indians in China. I just wanted to add one point on the technology bit, which Saheb just mentioned. The Indian government is planning to extend what it calls the trusted source mandate to tech devices like smart meters, etc. Drone parks, because a lot of drones which come from China, which have entered our markets, especially in our sensitive regions in Northeast India, are from China, have been used for malicious purposes. So I don't think we should even think of any sort of agreement in that sector, because it affects our periphery even more. And the periphery right now is not stable. Every country wants stability. China, as he was just mentioning, China had that sort of stability when it was opening up and its economic growth took off. We are trying the same thing right now. We need a stable periphery. So if we care about the stable periphery, we'll also have to think about non-trusted sources of technology from countries which we do not have excellent relations with.
You mentioned about the agreements that we had in the past, and we're now heading into a bilateral with Xi Jinping. You think the Chinese would insist on, there is a power asymmetry, you can't deny that. They would insist that any future agreements take that into account. In their own subtle manner, they would want to work out a kind of a deal where they are the top dogs.
I think the ball is frankly in China's court, because when we say free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific, we're recognizing the balance of power and recognizing the role China plays in the Indo-Pacific. So I think the ball is really in China's court, that it needs to recognize the role India plays and the relationships it has in the region. So I think we are doing our bit. India is doing its bit. It's in the Chinese court, frankly.
What's your sense?
I completely agree with him, because we've talked about cooperation over and over again. I think no other country in the world has been militarily on the borders, on the physical borders, been attacked as many times as India has. But every single time we've extended the hand of cooperation and friendship. Even after China was quote unquote liberated in 1949, we had our own sets of issues. We had two Pakistans, etc. We didn't even rake up to it. We thought that it's better to have a friend. There are multiple narratives about how we even gave up the UNSC seat. China is a big brother and so on. And our leadership thought of every way, including inviting China to the Bandung conference, to have a stable and a friendly and a brotherly relationship with China. But we've never been repaid with, I wouldn't even say gratitude, but not even with equality. So, one needs to track the pattern and understand as to why certain things have happened and whether they'll happen or not in the future. If it has happened so many times, there is no guarantee that it's not going to happen again in the future. And one needs to learn lessons. China, all said and done, is a great country in the sense that it remembers its history well and takes lessons from it. So I think that bit is something which Indian foreign policy also should learn.
So this is a repeated extension of the hand of friendship by us. Is that seen as weakness?
Politeness is seen as weakness.
My goodness.
So when you bow your head down too often, it will be seen as a weakness, especially when there's a power differential. And China has a power differential with us. Its worldviews are not the same as us, which is why we don't use the term alliances. We talk about friendships and partnerships. We want equality. That's how we see the world. But China sees things in terms of powers and balances. Number one currently for them is the US, followed by China. China is going to topple the US. Their worldview is very vertical. Ours is very horizontal. So that's the main difference where you know all our problems really lie, and the sooner we understand that, the better for us.
Any point on this you'd like to make?
No, I think like Dr. Pathak said, China believes in a hierarchy. And in a hierarchy, there can only be one person at the top. So, and that's not what we believe in. We believe in a multipolar world with regional balances of power, multiple actors. So there is a fundamental difference in approach.
So it's a cultural thing, isn't it? It's in their psyche, the way they...
A lot of things, even in whatever we do or any other country does, comes from its culture. Because look, our leadership is ultimately us. Our leaderships come from basically our cultures. We might have political differences, ideological differences and so on, but we basically come from the same country. So one can't really completely separate cultural thinking from how foreign policies are shaped. So,
I don't think I have anything more to add on this point.
So, okay, let's come to our last stage here. We're looking at the BRICS Summit. It's going to happen. An assessment from each of you as to what you would expect at the very minimum.
So, at the very minimum, 3 pillars of cooperation which were mentioned even during the BRICS foreign ministers meetings. First would be politics and security, economy and finance, and cultural and people-to-people exchanges. All very tricky for India because we can't really offend our partners in the West as China and Russia would want to or can afford to. We cannot really do that. Also, we don't have the same sorts of relations as China and Russia do with the West. We have different relations with the West. So politics and security is going to be problematic. Russia-Ukraine war is going to come up. Again, it's going to be very... Our approach to peace between Russia and Ukraine is different from China's and definitely different from Russia's. Israel-Hamas is going to come up. Again, difficult questions. So that would be politics. Difficult times ahead for India in the BRICS. Economy and finance. Again, there's going to be this whole sort of hectoring and moral high ground which will be taken by China, which will talk about how the West is very protectionist, forgetting the fact that it itself is protectionist against the Indian products. It's got tariff and non-tariff barriers against Indian products, etc. But it's going to do that. People-to-people cooperation, people-to-people exchanges. We've relaxed a bit of the visa regime, and China has also given a lot of visas. So I think in that sector, maybe there's going to be some sort of a talk that will not be as problematic as the other 2 pillars. And at best, I see BRICS as being something which is where India is in and does not want to get out, because our strategic culture is that once we are in, we are in. Yeah, we stay in. We don't leave out, even if it's a SARC. So we will stay in, but it's going to be problematic and difficult. That being said, since it's a sign of multilateralism, regionalism, and so on, we will just stick to it.
Chadha?
I think in BRICS, the challenge for India is to sort of thread this balance between Russian and Chinese interests, which are increasingly converging in the global south, in Central Asia, in other regions, in developing countries. The challenge is balancing Russian and Chinese imperatives with our own imperatives and our own interests in cooperation in development with the global south and in countries of the global south. That is something we have to thread.
And what about the Modi-Xi Jinping bilateral? Anything you would...
I think... it's not confirmed whether a bilateral will happen in the first place. It may or may not. You may have a full bilateral meeting, you may have, a pull aside like you've had in the past, or a conversation as both sides have described it. Like I said, the best case would be, realistically, that you have a full bilateral meeting and you have some consensus on disengagement, which, gets taken forward or not. Otherwise, you may not have a bilateral meeting at all. So, and as I mentioned, the broader picture is there's a lot of work to do in the India-China relationship. So, we should temper our expectations given that.
Sriparna, in your experience, when you looked at India-China meetings, would you say that meetings between 2 big leaders generally tend to happen only after they've cleared every dot and, crossed every T, or...
From China's side, it definitely happens like that, because there's a lot of preparation which goes into any of these meetings, including his people, his security personnel going to the country in advance and making sure that things are in place, there's no security threat and so on. I don't think any other country, including India, does it to that level of checking the T's and dotting the I's, but China does that. I'm a bit pessimistic with regards to these meetings between really big leaders. Even if, say, Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi do meet, I don't think there's going to be a bear hug from our side, the way it was with Biden or the way it was with Putin. That bear hug is not going to be there. It's going to be cold body language because things are not really normal between the two. Both are strong men in power. Both would not want to show a weak face to its domestic audiences. Definitely not Xi Jinping, definitely not Prime Minister Modi as well, which is why they'll have to keep the body language, in a way that which shows that we will uphold our sovereignty and etc. China will not give in to a lesser, weaker player like India. So, which is why I don't expect anything too great to come out of these meetings, which is why I say I'm a bit pessimistic. Also, Chinese psyche works this way. They would not want to appear weak to a weaker player like India. So, I don't hope much to change, even if there's a bilateral which happens between the two of them.
So a realist note to end on. Sriparna, Saheb Singh Chadha, thanks very much. Great talking to you, and I'm sure we'll invite you again once the bilateral is over, and let's see where we are going with it. Thanks very much for both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this edition of The Gist. Do join us for future editions of the same program. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good day.